Syril's mirror. Some viewers theorize that Syril Karn's obsession with Cassian Andor serves as a dark mirror, reflecting what Cassian could become without meaningful human connections. The show deliberately positions Syril as someone completely consumed by revenge and obsession, suggesting this is what happens when someone loses their humanity entirely to pursuit of a grudge. This theory proposes that Syril represents a cautionary tale about how the Empire corrupts even those who oppose it, turning them into obsessive functionaries, unable to see beyond personal vendetta. The parallel between Syril's desperation and Cassian's transformation throughout the series could indicate that Cassian succeeds where Syril fails, because he maintains some capacity for human connection and growth. If this theory holds true, Syril's irrelevance to Cassian becomes thematically intentional rather than cruel. The theory suggests that Tony Gilroy deliberately stripped Syril of dramatic significance to teach viewers that revenge obsession leads nowhere meaningful. Understanding Syril as a mirror reveals deeper commentary about how the rebellion requires human connection to function effectively, not just tactical brilliance. This interpretation suggests that Syril's pathetic pursuit throughout Season 2 serves as warning about what happens when individuals allow institutional systems to completely define their identity and worth. Ghorman's strategy. Fan theorists propose that the Ghorman Massacre represents the Empire's deliberate strategy of creating justified resistance movements to consolidate power in response. This theory suggests Imperial planners didn't accidentally trigger rebellion through brutality, but engineered the entire sequence, knowing it would provoke exactly the response they wanted from scattered resistance groups. The evidence supporting this theory includes the show depicting Imperial strategists planning the population response in advance, suggesting calculated manipulation rather than reactive cruelty. If this theory is correct, the Ghorman Massacre functions as a trap designed to unify disparate rebel cells into a centralized target the Empire can monitor and destroy. The theory proposes that the Empire deliberately crushes Ghorman specifically to test how quickly scattered resistance networks coordinate, gathering intelligence on rebel communication and leadership structures. This interpretation transforms the massacre from senseless brutality into strategic psychological warfare aimed at forcing the rebellion into the open. The theory becomes more compelling when considering the Empire's later ability to predict and intercept rebel movements throughout the season. This suggests that allowing such atrocities might serve the Empire's long-term strategic interests better than preventing them, since the massacre consolidates resistance into trackable patterns. Luthen's redemption. Viewers theorize that Luthen Rael's self-inflicted death represents his attempt at moral redemption for countless lives he sacrificed throughout his revolutionary career. This theory suggests that by choosing death rather than submitting to interrogation, Luthen finally refuses to sacrifice anyone else, making the ultimate sacrifice personally rather than ordering others to their deaths. The theory proposes that Kleya's role as Mercy Killer represents Luthen's last act of trust and human connection, after spending the series in complete isolation and moral compromise. If this interpretation is accurate, Luthen's death scene symbolizes redemption through finally practicing the sacrifice he preached to others, achieving moral consistency at the moment of his greatest vulnerability. The theory that Stellan Skarsgård's portrayal of acceptance reflects genuine peace rather than defeat suggests Luthen made this choice willingly, not as forced surrender. This theory gains strength from the show's repeated emphasis on Luthen's willingness to sacrifice, implying his death completes a thematic arc about finally sacrificing himself. Understanding his death as redemption rather than defeat transforms Luthen from simply another casualty into a character achieving moral closure. The theory further suggests that Luthen's entire narrative serves as meditation on whether redemption becomes possible for those who've committed terrible acts in service of greater causes. Kleya's origins. Fans theorize that Kleya Marki's background, as distinct from Cassian's, reveals a deeper narrative about how Imperial brutality creates thousands of similar trauma survivors scattered throughout the galaxy. This theory suggests the show deliberately avoided making them relatives to emphasize that Kleya and Cassian are not uniquely connected by blood, but bonded by shared experience of systemic violence. The theory proposes that their parallel origins represent how authoritarianism produces many potential resistance fighters, not just a chosen few, making rebellion something any sufficiently traumatized survivor might pursue. If this theory holds, the show's decision to keep their backgrounds separate serves thematic purposes about the universality of Imperial victimization rather than coincidental narrative construction. This interpretation suggests that the show's ambiguity about personal connections reflects how revolutionary commitment often prevents knowledge of family or loved ones. The theory that widespread Imperial brutality creates countless survivors without clear family bonds emphasizes systemic violence's isolation effect. Understanding these relationships as intentionally separate rather than hidden reveals how the show comments on systemic victimization across generations. The theory expands to suggest that every rebel character represents one of countless potential resistance fighters, each carrying untold backstories of Imperial trauma. Saw's sacrifice. Some theorize that Saw Gerrera deliberately chose rhydonium addiction as a calculated trade-off, sacrificing his long-term health to maintain short-term functional capacity for revolutionary work. This theory suggests Saw inhales rhydonium not purely accidentally, but strategically, aware that it keeps him alive despite his age and accumulated injuries, while slowly poisoning him. The theory proposes that this represents Saw's philosophical commitment to revolutionary work at any cost, literally consuming the Empire's resources to sustain his fight against them. If this interpretation is correct, Saw's breathing apparatus becomes a symbol of his reliance on the system he opposes, unable to resist the Empire without literally breathing in its materials. The theory that Saw's deterioration mirrors his increasingly extreme tactics suggests a connection between chemical and ideological corruption, both taking their toll simultaneously. This interpretation gains credibility when considering that Saw's addiction means he cannot escape the Empire's shadow, even in pursuit of resistance against it. The theory transforms Saw's character from victim of war trauma into someone actively choosing slow self-destruction in service of revolutionary ideals, achieving tragic consistency. The theory further proposes that Saw represents the ultimate cost of uncompromising resistance, showing viewers what commitment without restraint eventually produces. Women's philosophy. Theorists propose that Bix Caleen and Mon Mothma represent two fundamentally different philosophies about revolution that both prove necessary for sustainable resistance movements. This theory suggests Bix's choice to abandon the rebellion for motherhood reflects a necessary break on revolutionary zeal, preserving humanity and future generations from complete consumption by ideology. The theory proposes that Mon Mothma's public commitment represents the unavoidable endpoint where compromise becomes impossible and direct action becomes necessary, showing how even pragmatic moderates eventually reach moral breaking points. If this theory is correct, the show suggests that healthy resistance requires both those who preserve life and those willing to sacrifice everything, each correcting the excesses of the other. The theory that these women make radically different choices suggests the rebellion succeeds through diversity of commitment levels rather than requiring total sacrifice from everyone. This interpretation gains strength when considering the rebellion's future success depends on retaining both the Mon Mothmas who lead openly and the Bixes who maintain civilian infrastructure. The theory transforms their parallel storylines into commentary about sustainable revolution requiring both total commitment and selective withdrawal. The theory expands to suggest that feminist readings of the show reveal how women navigate revolutionary spaces differently than men, carving out paths that preserve agency. By the way, if you're into this type of content, I make videos like this all the time. A subscription would really help me out. Vel's evolution. Fans theorize that Vel Sartha represents a new generation of rebel leaders capable of learning from Luthen's mistakes while avoiding his complete moral hollowing. This theory suggests that Vel's willingness to make trust-based decisions reflects a hypothesis that the rebellion can maintain effectiveness without sacrificing personal connection entirely. The theory proposes that her mistakes throughout the season aren't failures, but necessary learning experiences that prepare her for leadership balancing tactical effectiveness with human values. If this interpretation is correct, Vel's story argues that future resistance movements don't require Luthen's level of moral compromise, suggesting the Empire's defeat becomes possible through different means. The theory that Vel contrasts sharply with ruthless Imperial operatives suggests that adaptable rebels who maintain humanity prove more resilient than those who abandon it completely. This theory gains credibility from the show, positioning Vel's generation as representing the future, implying that pragmatic idealism proves more sustainable than complete sacrifice. The theory transforms Vel from secondary character into potential progenitor of healthier resistance leadership that maintains both principle and humanity through the wars ahead. The theory suggests that Vel's journey represents hope that revolutionary movements can evolve toward less destructive approaches while remaining effective. Palpatine's absence. Theorists propose that even though Emperor Palpatine never appears directly in Andor, his influence might operate through systemic momentum he established before the series began. This theory suggests that Ghorman and other atrocities don't require Palpatine's explicit orders because the Empire functions as an autonomous brutality machine he designed and activated. The theory proposes that the absence of direct Palpatine involvement actually proves his success more completely than his appearance would, since the system operates with devastating efficiency without constant management. If this interpretation is correct, Palpatine's shadow looms larger through absence than presence could achieve, suggesting authoritarian systems eventually exceed their creator's control. The theory that characters cannot blame a single villain means they must confront that ordinary bureaucrats perpetuate systemic evil through their choices, making Palpatine's invisibility thematically crucial. This theory gains strength from writer Dan Gilroy's hints that Palpatine could have appeared in extended seasons, suggesting his absence was a deliberate choice, emphasizing institutional evil. The theory transforms the show's focus on mid-level operatives into sophisticated commentary about how authoritarianism persists through ordinary people making terrible choices. The theory expands to suggest that removing the ultimate villain forces audiences to recognize complicity in systemic oppression. Cassian's humanity. Some theorize that Cassian Andor's complete lack of Force sensitivity actually represents the show's central thesis about human potential and revolutionary capacity. This theory suggests that Cassian's effectiveness without supernatural gifts proves that ordinary humans can accomplish extraordinary resistance through training, trauma survival, and moral clarity about their oppressors. The theory proposes that by explicitly avoiding Force connection, the show argues that mystical destiny is unnecessary for heroism, that anyone sufficiently motivated can become dangerous to oppressive systems. If this interpretation is correct, Cassian becomes the rebellion's heart, not because he's chosen one, but because he chose resistance when confronted with imperial brutality. The theory that Cassian's ordinariness proves more compelling than supernatural abilities suggests a deliberate artistic statement about human agency and capability. This theory gains credibility when considering that the show could easily have added Force sensitivity, but explicitly refused to do so, indicating thematic intention. The theory transforms Cassian from a potentially legendary hero into a representative figure, proving that resistance is accessible to anyone willing to sacrifice for ideals. The theory further suggests that grounding Cassian's story in human capability, rather than mystical power, speaks to real-world resistance movements throughout history. Alliance's inevitability. Theorists propose that the Rebel Alliance's formation becomes an inevitable consequence of the Empire's own brutality, rather than the result of brilliant resistance planning. This theory suggests that by crushing worlds and creating countless survivors like Cassian, the Empire mathematically guarantees its opposition eventually crystallizes into a unified force. The theory proposes that the Empire's strategy of overwhelming force doesn't eliminate resistance but consolidates it, transforming scattered, desperate fighters into organized military structure. If this interpretation is correct, the Empire paradoxically engineers conditions for its own defeat by proving that negotiation and compromise remain impossible, forcing binary choice between submission and rebellion. The theory that brutal atrocities force political solutions is impossible means only military opposition remains viable as a legitimate response. This theory gains strength when considering that the rebellion eventually steals Death Star plans and challenges the Empire militarily, suggesting the alliance formed in this season becomes the opposition force. The theory transforms the rebellion from the organization of idealists into an inevitable response mechanism to authoritarian overreach, suggesting revolution becomes an inescapable logical consequence of oppression's severity. The theory expands to suggest that all authoritarian systems carry within them the seeds of their own destruction through systemic brutality. Dedra's complicity. Some theorists propose that Dedra Meero's fate represents poetic justice, suggesting that those who enable oppressive systems eventually become victims of those same systems. This theory suggests that Dedra's ruthless interrogation methods and intelligence gathering ultimately make her too dangerous for the Empire to allow freedom, turning her into a casualty of her own system. The theory proposes that her imprisonment reflects how authoritarianism eventually consumes even its most loyal servants when they become liability rather than asset. If this interpretation holds, Dedra's story serves as a cautionary tale about how climbing hierarchies of oppressive systems offers no security or reward. The theory that bureaucratic competence matters less than systemic loyalty suggests that Dedra's effectiveness as officer became the reason for her elimination, rather than protection. This theory gains credibility when considering how totalitarian systems historically eliminate successful subordinates once they accumulate too much knowledge or power. The theory transforms Dedra from antagonist into a tragic figure caught within machinery she helped construct. The theory expands to suggest that complicity in oppression offers no refuge from oppression's consequences. Hope's sustainability. Fans theorize that the show deliberately positions various characters making different choices to suggest that hope requires both sacrifice and preservation. This theory suggests that without characters like Bix choosing life and continuity, resistance movements become unsustainable cycles of sacrifice and trauma. The theory proposes that hope for future victory requires maintaining something worth protecting, meaning some must step back from total commitment to preserve civilization itself. If this interpretation is correct, the show argues that revolution succeeds not through total sacrifice, but through distributed commitment across different roles and sacrifice levels. The theory that diverse approaches to resistance prove more effective than uniform dedication suggests that healthy movements require ideological disagreement. This theory gains credibility from the show's refusal to present any single character's approach as a definitively correct path. The theory transforms the narrative from instructional text into philosophical meditation about revolution's nature. The theory expands to suggest that audiences must grapple with whether their own potential resistance roles require total sacrifice or sustainable participation. Andor's legacy. Theorists propose that Andor itself represents a statement about what science fiction resistance narratives might accomplish when focused on ordinary people rather than chosen ones. This theory suggests that positioning Cassian as unremarkable operative rather than legendary hero speaks to show's core thesis about everyone's potential. The theory proposes that by avoiding force sensitivity, mystical destiny, and chosen one narrative, the show argues that resistance capability exists within ordinary human experience. If this interpretation is correct, Andor becomes a political statement about revolutionary potential inherent in systemic opposition rather than rare gifts. The theory that the show's grounded approach to rebellion proves more compelling than mythological presentations suggests intentional artistic choice. This theory gains credibility from the show's consistent refusal to mystify resistance or present revolutionary action as requiring special abilities. The theory transforms Andor from entertainment into philosophical argument about human agency and systemic change. The theory expands to suggest that perhaps the most radical science fiction statement occurs not through spectacular action, but through insistence that ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things through commitment and sacrifice. If you found this valuable, consider subscribing so you never miss new uploads. Thanks for watching.